She was chased for escaping from a camp. A cowboy paid the debt and lifted her onto his horse. Clara had never imagined her life would lead her to this. The sun had barely risen, but already the heat of the day was beginning to settle over the land. The distant hills seemed to shimmer under the oppressive weight of the desert heat. It was a land of dust, sweat, and hard labor, and it had become her prison for the last few months. The camp she had been sent to wasn't like a regular place of work. It was more like a trap, hidden in the wildest corners of the plains, far from any town or city. Clara had been brought here under the pretense of helping out with some household chores for the camp's owner. But soon enough, she realized the truth. The owner was a cruel man who dealt in debts that people like her family could never pay. When her father had failed to fulfill a financial promise, Clara had become the one to bear the consequences. Her family's debt wasn't something that could be paid with money or hard work. No matter how much she toiled under the hot sun, it was never enough to free her. She was just one of many who were caught in this cycle. But Clara had always been determined to survive. It was the only thing she had left, the strength to keep going despite the hardship. She kept to herself mostly, doing her chores quietly, never drawing attention to herself. She knew what would happen if she did. The overseers were sharp-eyed, and their punishments could come at any moment. She learned to follow orders, keep her head down, and avoid the guards as much as she could. But the breaking point came one night. As the evening settled in, Clara couldn't sleep. The stars outside her small shack were faint behind the thick veil of smoke from the campfires. She lay awake, feeling the rough mattress beneath her, the same mattress that had carried her through so many restless nights. It wasn't the discomfort that kept her awake, it was something else. It was the thought that this life, this never-ending struggle, could go on forever. It wasn't living. It was barely surviving. That night, something in her broke. She couldn't bear the idea of living like this any longer. She'd heard whispers of others trying to escape, but they had all failed. The camp was too well guarded. Yet, despite the dangers, she couldn't ignore the flicker of hope inside her heart. Freedom was out there. She just had to find a way to reach it. The decision wasn't easy. She knew that if she was caught, the punishment would be severe, worse than severe. But in that moment, she no longer cared. The fear of getting caught was nothing compared to the fear of staying trapped here forever. So, with trembling hands, she packed what little she could carry, a few scraps of food and a spare blanket. She moved silently through the camp, her heart pounding in her chest. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She didn't know when she would have another chance. The moon was high in the sky, casting long shadows over the camp as Clara made her way to the edge of the compound. She could feel the cold night air on her skin, but it did little to calm the fire that burned inside her. She had to get out. She had to try. The guards patrolled the fences, their voices echoing through the night. Clara knew the layout of the camp well. She had spent weeks observing the guards, learning their routines, and looking for any opening, any weakness. Tonight, she was going to take her chance. She reached the outer fence, a rusty barbed wire structure that had been put up to keep people in, not out. The hole she had spotted earlier was small, but just big enough for her to slip through. With a deep breath, Clara crouched low, her body pressed against the earth. She could hear the guards in the distance, but they hadn't noticed her yet. She carefully wiggled her body through the hole, the barbed wire catching on her sleeves, but she didn't stop. Her heart was racing now, louder than her footfalls on the dirt. She was free. The outside world, the vast open space, was before her. For a moment, Clara allowed herself to breathe, but only for a moment. The sound of footsteps approached from behind. Her eyes widened. They had seen her escape. There was no turning back now. She started running, her feet kicking up dust as she sprinted into the wilderness. She could hear the guard shouting, but she didn't look back. She focused only on the path ahead. The cold night air stung her face, but the sensation was welcome. It reminded her she was alive, she was free. At least for now. Her legs burned as she ran, but she pushed forward, ignoring the pain. The sound of hooves reached her ears, and she realized that the guards were on horseback, gaining on her. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't outrun them on foot. Not like this. She needed to think. She needed a plan. The river. The river was nearby. She had heard the others mention it, the wide, fast-moving water that could wash away any traces of her. If she could make it to the river, she might just lose them. With renewed determination, she veered toward the left, heading toward the distant sound of rushing water. She could hear the horses behind her, their riders shouting orders to one another. They were getting closer. She had to move faster. Clara's breath came in sharp gasps now. The river was so close. If she could just make it a few more yards, she would be able to hide in the water and disappear from their sight. She could do this. She had to. Just as she neared the riverbank, she stumbled on a loose stone, tumbling forward into the cold, rushing water. The impact knocked the air out of her lungs, and she fought to keep her head above the surface. The current was strong, but Clara struggled against it, her arms flailing as she swam with all her might. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The guards were yelling, but their voices were now faint in the distance. Clara let the water carry her, pushing her farther away from the camp and everything that had held her captive. Her body was exhausted, but her spirit was alive. For the first time in months, Clara felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't know where she would go next, but she knew one thing for sure: she would never go back. Clara's heart was racing, and every breath she took felt like it was being ripped from her lungs. The cold water of the river splashed against her face as she fought to keep herself afloat. She couldn't let the current pull her downstream. She had to keep moving. Her arms were aching, her muscles burning from the strain, but she didn't stop. She knew that if she slowed down for even a second, the guards would catch up. They wouldn't stop until they had her back in the camp, and that was something she couldn't let happen. The sound of hooves was still echoing in the distance, but it was growing fainter. She had to be getting further away from them. The river was swift, but it was her only hope. She pushed harder, moving faster through the water. The current was strong, but Clara was determined. She had always been a fighter, even when the odds seemed impossible. She glanced to her left and saw the bank fading away, the trees and rocks blurred by the rushing water. Her limbs were tired, but she couldn't afford to stop. If she did, she would be trapped. She had to keep going. The sound of the hooves was almost gone now, but she could still hear the shouts of the men chasing her, their voices carrying through the night air. Clara didn't know how far she had come, but she couldn't stop to find out. The water was cold and unwelcoming, but it felt like a lifeline. She had no choice but to trust it. As the river carried her downstream, Clara struggled to stay calm. She couldn't help but think of all the people who had tried to escape before her, only to be caught and brought back to the camp. It seemed like there was no escape from the horrors of that place, no way to break free from the chains that bound them. But Clara was determined to prove them wrong. She wasn't like the others. She was stronger than they thought. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden shock of hitting something hard beneath the water. She gasped, but her feet barely touched the bottom before the current dragged her away again. She was still moving, but now she was starting to feel dizzy, the water and the cold taking its toll on her body. She forced herself to stay focused. She couldn't afford to lose her concentration now. The last thing she needed was to panic. She had to make it to safety. After what felt like hours, the river began to slow. The rush of the water softened, and Clara noticed that the trees on the riverbank had become thicker, the land more rugged and wild. She couldn't see any signs of the camp or the men chasing her, but she knew better than to think they had given up. They would be searching for her, combing the area, trying to track her down. It was only a matter of time before they realized she had gone down the river and started searching along its banks. Clara's mind raced. She needed to find a place to hide, somewhere safe, somewhere far from the camp. She couldn't go back, and she couldn't let herself be caught again. She had come too far to fail now. The current began to slow even more, and Clara could finally feel the bottom of the river beneath her feet. She took a deep breath, wading through the water until she reached the shallows. Her legs felt like jelly, and her body was trembling from the cold and the exhaustion. But she pushed through. She had to keep moving. Clara stumbled up the riverbank, her feet slipping on the wet rocks. The world seemed to spin as she stood up, but she gritted her teeth and forced herself to take a few steps forward. She needed to find shelter, and fast. There was no telling how close the guards were, or how long they would search the river. The longer she stayed exposed, the more likely they would find her. She looked around, her eyes scanning the land. It was dark, but the moonlight gave her just enough to see the surrounding trees and the scattered rocks. She spotted a small, cave-like opening under a cluster of rocks a few yards away. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Clara hurried toward it, her feet crunching over the dry leaves and twigs on the ground. She reached the opening, ducking down to crawl inside. It was cramped and cold, but it provided her with the cover she needed. She sat down against the back of the small cave, drawing her knees up to her chest as she tried to catch her breath. Her heart was still pounding in her chest and her body was shivering from the cold, but she had made it this far. She had to believe that she could make it even further. She stayed there, hidden in the cave, listening for any signs of the men who might be searching for her. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was hard to know how long she had been hiding, but it felt like an eternity. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not yet. As she sat there trying to warm herself with her arms wrapped around her knees, Clara began to think about everything she had left behind. The camp, her family, the life she had once known. It felt like a distant memory, but it was still fresh in her mind. She had lost everything, but she had gained something too. Freedom. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She had escaped, and she wasn't going back. But Clara knew she couldn't stay in the cave forever. Eventually, she would have to keep moving. She didn't know where she would go or how she would survive, but she had to keep going. She had to find a way to start over, to build a new life. As the hours passed, Clara's thoughts began to clear, and her body started to warm up. She knew that she couldn't stay hidden forever, but she also knew that it wasn't safe to move just yet. The guards would still be out there, and if she wasn't careful, they would find her again. She needed to wait until the coast was clear before she ventured out. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, but eventually, Clara heard something that made her freeze. A sound. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. The sound of hooves. Her heart skipped a beat. She held her breath, listening. The sound was getting closer. Her first instinct was to hide deeper in the cave, but she stopped herself. If they were getting close, she couldn't let them find her here. She needed to move, and she needed to do it quickly. Clara stood up, her body still weak from the cold and exhaustion, but she couldn't afford to wait any longer. She had to leave before they found her. She glanced around the cave one last time before slipping out into the night. Clara's legs felt like lead as she crept through the thick underbrush, the dark trees casting long shadows across the forest floor. The sounds of the forest seemed to grow louder with every step she took, each crackling twig beneath her feet. Every rustling leaf made her jump. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, that the shadows were closing in. But she couldn't afford to look back now. The guards were still out there, and she had no choice but to keep moving. She'd been running for hours, the adrenaline from her escape beginning to wear off. Her body was tired, sore, and covered in bruises from the rough terrain, but she knew she couldn't stop. Not yet. She didn't know where she was or how far the nearest town was, but she couldn't stay in the woods. She had to keep going no matter what. The trees around her grew denser, the path more difficult to navigate. The forest felt endless. Clara pushed through the undergrowth, each step becoming harder than the last. Her arms were scratched by the sharp branches, and the sting from the cuts only made her more aware of how much she had endured. She had been running for so long, and she was beginning to feel the weight of her choices. That was when she heard the sound of hooves again. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze. The sound was faint at first, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't the clattering of the guards' horses. This was different. The pace was steadier, calmer. Clara felt a flicker of hope, though she didn't know why. She forced herself to take a few slow, cautious steps backward into the trees, trying to conceal herself in the thick underbrush. The last thing she needed now was to be spotted again. The hooves grew louder, and she held her breath. Whoever was approaching wasn't in a hurry. The sound wasn't frantic or urgent like the pursuit she had just escaped. It was deliberate and steady. Clara glanced nervously around, her hand brushing against the rough bark of a tree as she kept her back to it. She couldn't see anything, but the sound was getting closer. Then, through the thick trees, she saw a figure on horseback. The rider appeared almost like a shadow himself, cloaked in darkness, his figure tall and broad. His horse moved quietly, almost blending with the night. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the rider drew closer. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, hoping he wouldn't see her. But it wasn't the guards. No, this man moved with a certain calmness, as though he was in control of everything around him. The rider stopped a few feet away, his horse turning slightly, grazing the trees as it came to a slow halt. Clara dared to glance out from behind the tree and saw the rider's face illuminated by the soft light from the moon. His eyes were sharp, focused, and there was something about him that was different from the others. He didn't seem threatening. In fact, he had an air of quiet confidence. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, but Clara could still make out the strong jaw and weathered features of a man who had spent years riding across harsh lands. He was dressed in worn leather, his coat and boots sturdy and practical. His presence alone seemed to give the air a sense of authority. Clara knew she couldn't remain hidden forever. She had already made that mistake once before. The man on horseback could easily pass by without noticing her, but she couldn't take that chance. She had to move. The guards could be nearby. She took a deep breath and, without thinking, stepped from behind the tree. The rider's sharp gaze turned toward her in an instant. His horse shifted beneath him, and he raised an eyebrow as he took in the sight of her, a young woman, alone, lost in the woods, looking like she had just been through a storm. Clara stood still, her heart racing. She didn't know what to expect from this man. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves in the wind and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. The man's voice was low and steady when he finally spoke. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Clara's mind raced. She had to come up with something. She couldn't tell him the truth. About the camp, about the guards, about her escape. She had no idea who he was or whether she could trust him. The last thing she wanted was to get caught up in more trouble. I'm just passing through," Clara said, trying to sound as convincing as possible. She didn't even believe her own words. But she had to say something. The rider studied her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Clara couldn't read him. His face was too hard to interpret, his thoughts hidden behind a veil of experience. But something in his expression softened just slightly. "Passing through?" he repeated. "This is no place to be alone, especially at night." Clara took a hesitant step forward, trying to maintain some semblance of composure. "I'm fine," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "I'll be all right." The rider didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced around the surrounding forest, his eyes scanning the shadows as if searching for something. Clara felt a pang of unease. She didn't know what he was looking for, but she could sense that he was no stranger to these woods. He was familiar with the dangers of the wilderness, and she could tell that he had no intention of leaving her to face them alone. After a long pause, the rider finally spoke again. "You're not fine!" "You look like you've been running for hours."
His voice was gentler now, almost concerned.
"Where are you headed?" Clara's eyes flickered to the ground, her mind racing. "I don't know," she whispered, almost to herself. She couldn't tell him the truth. She couldn't explain why she was out here, why she was alone, why she was so afraid. The rider seemed to sense her hesitation. "Look, I'm not going to force you to talk." "But you're not going anywhere like this." He gestured to her torn clothes, the bruises visible on her arms, and the exhaustion in her eyes. "You need help, and I can offer that." Clara took a step back, her fear rising again. She had no idea who this man was or what his intentions were, but she couldn't risk trusting him, not when she was so close to freedom. "I'm fine," she said again, more firmly this time. I can take care of myself. The man didn't move. He didn't press her further. Instead, he simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, after a moment of silence, he sighed and nodded, as if coming to a decision. You're free to go, he said, his voice softer now. But if you're smart, you'll take my offer. You don't want to be out here alone at night, especially not with the way things are.
Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what to do.
She was so close to freedom, so close to escaping, but the man's words rang in her ears. Was she really ready to risk everything by wandering through the night, alone and vulnerable? The rider waited, watching her closely. Clara had a choice to make. She could continue on her own, hoping to outrun the dangers, or she could trust this man, this stranger, and see where his offer led. After what felt like an eternity, Clara finally spoke. I'll take your offer. The rider nodded, his face softening just a little. Good choice, he said, offering a slight smile. He extended a hand toward her, his gesture not forceful but welcoming. Clara hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. She placed her hand in his, and he helped her onto his horse, lifting her with surprising strength. As she settled behind him, Clara couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't alone. The rider clicked his tongue, urging his horse forward. The sound of hooves began to echo through the forest once again, and Clara held on tightly, unsure of what the future held, but knowing she had taken a step towards something better. For the first time since she had escaped the camp, she felt a glimmer of hope. The journey was long, and Clara's mind raced as the man guided his horse through the thick forest. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting a soft glow on the path ahead. Clara's body ached from the ordeal she had just endured, but the motion of the horse beneath her was comforting, and the steady rhythm of its hooves against the earth helped calm her racing thoughts. The man had not spoken much since he helped her onto the horse. He was a man of few words, but Clara didn't mind. She needed time to process everything that had happened. As they traveled deeper into the forest, the sounds of the wilderness surrounded them. The rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. Clara hadn't realized just how much she had missed the peace and quiet of nature. The camp, with its harsh rules and constant tension, had made her forget the simple beauty of the world around her. Now, as they rode through the forest, she felt a strange sense of freedom she hadn't experienced in months. After what seemed like hours, the man slowed the horse, guiding it toward a small clearing. Clara could see a small cabin in the distance, tucked away between the trees. The cabin looked humble, but it was well kept, with a small garden in front and a thin column of smoke rising from the chimney. It was a peaceful place, far removed from the chaos of the camp Clara had escaped. The man dismounted first, then reached up to help Clara down. She hesitated for a moment, her feet touching the ground softly. She hadn't been on solid ground in what felt like forever. The sensation was strange, almost surreal. She looked up at the cabin, then at the man, who was already heading toward the door. "You can rest here for the night," he said, his voice low but steady. "We'll figure things out in the morning." Clara nodded silently, her throat tight with emotion. She had no idea where this man had come from or why he had decided to help her, but in that moment, she was grateful. She was grateful for the kindness of a stranger, for the chance to rest, to think, and to heal. She didn't feel alone anymore. The man opened the door and motioned for Clara to enter. She stepped inside cautiously, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The cabin was small but cozy, with a simple stone fireplace crackling softly in the corner. There was a small table with 2 chairs, a wooden bookshelf filled with books, and a few candles scattered about, casting a warm glow over the room. It was a stark contrast to the cold, sterile environment of the camp, and Clara couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. The man closed the door behind her and walked over to the fireplace, poking the logs to keep the flames going. Clara stood by the door for a moment, unsure of what to do. She was tired, her body still sore from the escape, but she didn't want to impose. She had always been independent, always took care of herself, but for the first time in a long while she allowed herself to be still, to rest. "You're safe here," the man said, his voice breaking the silence. He glanced over at Clara. "I'm not going to ask you what happened. You've been through enough." Clara didn't know why, but hearing those words from him made her feel a sense of relief. She didn't have to explain herself. She didn't have to relive the horrors of the camp. She didn't have to explain why she had run. For the first time in a long time, Clara felt like she could breathe. She walked over to the small table and sat down in one of the chairs, her body aching as she did. She could feel the weight of the past few days pressing on her, everything she had gone through, the fear, the escape, the uncertainty. She wanted to let it all go, but it was hard. The memories still haunted her, and she knew that they would stay with her for a long time. The man came over and placed a steaming cup of tea in front of Clara. "Drink this! It'll help with the cold!" Clara took the cup, her fingers brushing against his for a brief moment. She looked up at him, searching for any signs of kindness or danger, but his face was calm, unreadable. There was something about him that made her feel safe, even though she didn't know anything about him. She took a small sip of the tea, letting the warmth spread through her. The hot liquid soothed her throat, and the steam from the cup made her feel a little more at ease. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She hadn't realized how much she had needed to say those words. The man nodded but said nothing. He didn't seem to need any acknowledgement. It was clear that he wasn't doing this for thanks. He was just helping because that was who he was. They sat in silence for a while, Clara sipping her tea and the man tending to the fire. She felt a strange sense of calm settle over her as the warmth from the flames reached her skin. The air was thick with quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, something she hadn't felt in so long. Finally, the man spoke again, breaking the stillness. "I'm Jack," he said, his tone casual. "I live here. Been living here for a while now, away from the rest of the world." Clara looked up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied his face. "Jack," she repeated, committing the name to memory. It felt good to know something about him, even something as simple as his name. She couldn't explain why, but it felt like a step toward trusting him, toward understanding him. "I didn't mean to intrude," Clara said after a moment. I didn't know where else to go." Jack looked at her then, his expression softening. "You're not intruding. No one should have to live the way you were living. Everyone deserves to be free. You can stay here as long as you need." Clara's heart fluttered with emotion at his words. She had never been given that kind of reassurance before. In the camp, no one cared about her freedom. She had been nothing more than a tool to be used and discarded. But here, with Jack, she felt like she could be more, like she had a chance at a new life. She set the cup down on the table, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't know how to repay you for this," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Jack's face remained calm, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps sympathy, perhaps understanding, in his eyes. "You don't need to repay me. Just don't forget that you have a choice now. You're free." The words hit Clara like a wave. Free! It had been so long since she had felt that way. The weight of the camp, the chains of the past had been suffocating her for so long. But here, in this small cabin, with Jack's quiet kindness, she was beginning to feel something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. "I won't forget," she whispered, almost to herself. She could feel the tears pricking at her eyes, but she held them back. She didn't want to cry. Not yet. She had cried enough. But for the first time in so long, she felt like she could breathe again. And that, she realized, was the first step toward healing. The next few days passed in a quiet rhythm that Clara had never experienced before. The cabin, tucked away in the heart of the forest, became her sanctuary. The noise of the camp, the shouting, the constant pressure and the fear, everything was a distant memory. Now, there was only the soft rustling of the trees, the sound of birds in the morning, and the comforting crackle of the fire in the evenings. Jack, though a man of few words, never made Clara feel unwelcome. His gestures were simple but kind, like the cup of tea he had given her the first night, or the way he always made sure she had enough food. He didn't push her to talk, to tell her story. He gave her space to breathe and heal. And in return, Clara began to open up more, little by little. Her body still ached from the escape, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the weight that had been lifted from her heart. For the first time in months, Clara felt like she could trust someone again, someone who didn't look at her like she was just a thing to be controlled or used. Jack didn't ask her about her past, but she could see the understanding in his eyes. He knew what it was like to be alone, to carry a burden. And that was enough for Clara to know she was safe here. Each morning, Jack went about his work, chopping wood, tending to the small garden behind the cabin, and checking traps he had set in the woods. Clara helped when she could, cleaning and cooking, but she was still recovering, still learning to relax and not constantly worry about what was next. She wasn't used to feeling like she could just be. For so long, she had been focused on survival, on getting by from one day to the next. Now, she was starting to realize there was more to life than just existing. One afternoon, after they had finished their work, Clara and Jack sat by the fire in the cabin. The air outside was cool, the sun beginning to dip behind the trees. Clara, wrapped in a woolen blanket, stared into the flames, lost in thought. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, and for a moment she allowed herself to relax fully, letting the warmth of the fire seep into her bones. Jack, sitting across from her, broke the silence. "You have been quiet today," he said, his voice low but steady. "Something on your mind?" Clara looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. She hesitated before speaking, her thoughts drifting back to the past, to everything she had left behind. But here, in the warmth of the cabin, she felt like she could finally share a piece of her story. "I've been thinking about everything," she said softly. "About the camp, about my family, about everything I've been through. I never thought I'd make it out." Her voice faltered for a moment, but she steadied herself. "I never thought there was anything beyond it, beyond that life. But now I feel like I can breathe." Jack didn't respond right away. He just sat there, listening, and that in itself was comforting to Clara. His silence wasn't judgment or impatience, it was understanding. After a while, he spoke again. "Sometimes it's hard to see the light when you're trapped in the dark," Jack said, his eyes focused on the fire. "I know what it's like to feel like there's no way out. But sometimes you just have to keep going, even when it seems impossible. You find a way out even if you don't know how." Clara nodded, her eyes downcast for a moment as she thought about his words. She had spent so much of her life in the dark, both literally and figuratively. The camp had been her prison, and her escape had been nothing short of a miracle. But Jack was right. She had kept going, even when it seemed like there was no way out. And now she was here, in this cabin, with a chance at something new. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could face it. She looked up at Jack again, her voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, "for everything you've done. I don't even know why you're helping me. You don't know me. I'm just some stranger you found in the woods." Jack's gaze softened and he shrugged slightly. "Everyone deserves a chance," he said simply. "I've been in your shoes before. Not exactly the same, but I know what it's like to need help. When you've been given that chance, you pass it on." Clara absorbed his words, feeling a knot in her chest loosen. Jack's kindness, his willingness to help without expecting anything in return, was something she hadn't experienced before. She had always been on her own, always fighting for her survival, always trying to prove that she could handle it all alone. But here, Jack was showing her that it didn't have to be that way. She didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her own. For the rest of the evening they sat in companionable silence, the warmth of the fire filling the cabin, and the peace of the night settling around them. Clara's thoughts drifted to the future. She didn't know exactly what she would do next, but she knew one thing for sure. She was free now. She didn't have to live in fear anymore. She could choose her own path. The next morning, Clara woke early to the sound of birds singing outside. She stretched and yawned, the sunlight streaming through the small window of the cabin. It was a beautiful day, and Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of calm wash over her. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew it was hers to shape. When she joined Jack outside, he was already working in the garden, pulling weeds from the small patch of vegetables they had been growing. Clara watched him for a moment before walking over to help. She had never been much of a gardener, but there was something therapeutic about the work. It was simple, but it gave her a sense of purpose, a sense that she was contributing to something more than just herself. As the days turned into weeks, Clara began to settle into her new life. The fear that had once consumed her began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. She spent her days helping Jack with the chores around the cabin, tending to the garden, and learning how to live a life that wasn't driven by survival alone. For the first time in a long time, she found herself smiling more. Laughing, even. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. But Clara knew that her past wasn't something she could just forget. The memories of the camp, the years of hardship, would always be a part of her. But she didn't let them define her anymore. She had escaped, and she had found something better, something worth fighting for. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, casting a golden glow over the forest, Jack and Clara sat outside, watching the sky change colors. Jack glanced over at Clara, his eyes thoughtful. "You've come a long way," he said quietly. "You've made it? You're free now." Clara smiled, her heart full. "I never thought I'd get here," she said softly. "But I have you to thank for it. You gave me that chance." Jack nodded, his expression softening. "I didn't give you a chance. You took it. You've always had it in you. You just had to find it." Clara looked out at the horizon, the sky now painted in shades of orange and purple. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace with herself. The road ahead was uncertain, but she was ready to face it. She wasn't alone anymore. "I'll never forget this," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "I'll never forget you." Instead, he simply sat there beside her, both of them watching the sunset in silence, knowing that this moment, this peace, was something they had both earned.